Welcome to this presentation on the miracles of the Eucharist. The information in this exhibition began with the faith of one young man, Carlo Acutis, who was devoted to Jesus and to the Eucharist. Carlo Acutis was born in London, England on May 3, 1991, to an Italian couple. He was baptized at Our Lady of Dolores in London on May 18, 1991. By September, the family had returned to live in Milan, Italy. Carlo's mother describes her son, quote, "I had him baptized, but I was born into a secular family. Even as a child, he showed great piety. At the age of 3, when we passed in front of a church, he wanted to go in, greet Jesus on the cross and Jesus in the tabernacle, and bring little flowers to Our Lady. At the age of 4.5, he was reading the Bible and the lives of the saints and was praying the Rosary. If in the case of Saint Therese of Lisieux, her parents were the great educators, in the case of Carlo, the roles were reversed. He was my great educator in the faith." At his own request at the age of 7, Carlo received his first communion. His mother recalls, quote, "As a little boy, especially after his first communion, he never missed his daily appointment with the Holy Mass and the Rosary, followed by a moment of Eucharistic adoration." When Carlo was 9, his mother states, quote, "He was reading computer engineering textbooks. He learned algorithms with which he created programs, then websites for parishes, the Jesuits, the Vatican. In the summer, instead of having fun, he would stay at his computer until 3 a.m. He wanted to spread the good news, the gospel, and he used his extraordinary skills to proclaim Christ and help others come closer to God." In 2002, at the age of 11, Carlo began researching the Eucharistic miracles that have occurred throughout history. 3 years later, in 2005, he completed an online exhibit of these miracles on a website he designed. On this website, in 19 different languages, people around the world can read about Eucharistic miracles throughout history. Carlo lived his life with a great love for Jesus. He once said, quote, "My life plan is to always be connected to Jesus." In 2006, at the age of 15, just 10 days after becoming ill and being diagnosed with an aggressive form of leukemia, Carlo died. The date was October 12, 2006. On October 10, 2020, at the Basilica of St. Francis of Assisi, Italy, the Roman Catholic Church beatified Carlo because of his faith and his efforts to make the world aware of the many ways the Eucharist, the body of Jesus Christ, has resulted in miraculous events. His website has inspired people around the world to focus on the Eucharist, the real presence of our Lord Jesus Christ. And so, relying upon Carlo's website, here are some of the miracles in his international exhibition, Miracles of the Eucharist Across the World. Carlo's exhibit details 110 Eucharistic miracles that have occurred in 20 different countries. 98 of the 110 miracles took place in Europe, while 7 occurred in South America. 3 countries stand out as having the greatest number of Eucharistic miracles: Italy, Spain, and France. Italy has had the most miracles, 32, followed by Spain with 19, and France with 12. Eucharistic miracles have occurred with both the bread and wine consecrated into the body and blood of Jesus Christ. Miraculous healings, powers, and even levitation and emission of light from consecrated hosts have been recorded over the centuries. All of these are included on Carlo Acutis' website, where you can read about them in detail. Let's focus on 6 categories of Eucharistic miracles, providing a few examples of each category. So, there are consecrated hosts that 1. Transform into myocardium or heart tissue. 2. Are preserved for extremely long periods of time. 3. Survive being in a fire. 4. Are bleeding. 5. Sustain people for decades. And 6. Have images appear on them. Let's begin with 5 instances of consecrated hosts that transformed into myocardium or heart tissue. There is the case of Lanciano, Italy in the year 750, then Buenos Aires, Argentina in 1996, Tixla, Mexico in 2006, Sokolka, Poland in 2008, and Legnica, Poland in 2013. This Eucharistic miracle occurred at Lanciano, Italy, around the year 750 A.D. A monastic priest doubted whether the body of our Lord was truly present in the consecrated host. He celebrated Mass, and when he said the words of consecration, he saw the host turn into flesh and the wine turn into blood. Everything was visible to those in attendance. On the left is a painting of the miracle located in Valsecca Chapel, where the relics were housed from 1636 until 1902. On the right, you can see the monstrance containing the Eucharist at the top and the 5 coagulated drops of blood in the crystal chalice at the bottom. On the left is a close-up of the Eucharist. The flesh consists of part of the left ventricle of a myocardium. The arteries and veins can be easily identified, as well as a double slender branch of the vagus nerve. To the right, you see microscopic images of the heart tissue. In 1970, scientists at the University of Siena studied the relics and reported, quote, "The flesh is true human flesh, formed by the muscular tissue of the heart. The blood is true blood, belonging to the same blood type AB as the flesh. The component substances are those of human tissue, normal and fresh. The conservation of the flesh and the blood, left in their natural state for 12 centuries and exposed to the influence of atmospheric and biological elements, remains an extraordinary phenomenon." On the left, you see a close-up of the 5 coagulated drops of blood. Dr. Edward Lanoli, director of the hospital in Arezzo, Italy, and professor of anatomy, histology, chemistry, and clinical microscopy, performed a thorough scientific examination on the relics of the miracle, which had occurred 12 centuries earlier. On March 4, 1971, the professor presented a detailed report in which he concluded that, quote, "The miraculous flesh is authentic flesh consisting of muscular striated tissue of the myocardium. The miraculous blood is truly blood. The chromatographic analysis indicated this with absolute and indisputable certainty. The immunological study shows with certitude that the flesh and the blood are human, and the immunohematological test allows us to affirm with complete objectivity and certitude that both belong to the same blood type AB, the same blood type as that of the man of the Shroud of Turin. The proteins contained in the blood have the normal distribution in the identical percentage as that for normal fresh blood. No histological dissection has revealed any trace of salt infiltrations or preservative substances used in antiquity for the purposes of embalming." Unquote. At St. Mary Parish in Buenos Aires, Argentina, on August 15, 1996, a consecrated host fell on the ground during communion and was placed in water in the tabernacle to be dissolved. On August 26, the host had not dissolved, but was transforming into blood. It was not until January 28, 2000, almost 4 years later, that scientists at a genetics lab in San Francisco analyzed the samples and found them to contain human DNA. In 2001, a sample was examined by Professor Edward Lanoli, the doctor who had examined the Eucharist of Lanciano, Italy. He determined the sample was human heart tissue. In 2002, a sample was brought to Professor John Walker at the University of Sydney in Australia. He was not told where the sample came from. He confirmed that it showed muscle cells and intact white blood cells. White blood cells disintegrate after 15 minutes outside the body, but after 6 years, they were still present in this sample. 2 years later, in 2004, Professor Frederick Zugibe of Columbia University, the preeminent expert in forensic medicine of the heart, received the 1996 sample without knowing that it came from a consecrated host. Dr. Zugibe confirmed that the sample corresponded to muscle of the heart, precisely the left ventricle, and that the patient to whom it belonged had suffered greatly because it showed some thrombi, which indicated that at certain moments the patient lacked oxygen. According to the professor, the heart showed dynamic activity at the instant in which it was brought into the laboratory. Intact white blood cells were found. This confirmed that the sample was somehow alive. On October 21, 2006, during a retreat mass held by St. Martin of Tours Parish at the local hall in Tixla, Mexico, a religious sister who was assisting 2 priests in giving out communion was about to take a host from her ciborium when she saw it was oozing a reddish substance. She turned toward the pastor with tears in her eyes as she showed him what was happening. Several scientific researchers who did not know the origin of the sample conducted tests on the host between October 2009 and October 2012. These are their findings. 1. The reddish substance corresponds to human blood containing hemoglobin and DNA. 2. The substance originated from within the host. It was not applied from the outside. 3. The blood type is AB, the same as the miracle of Lanciano and the Shroud of Turin. 4. The closer to the host the blood is, the fresher it is. Even in 2010, 4 years after the miracle first occurred, indicating that the blood flows from the host as if from a wound. 5. Active white blood cells, red blood cells, and live macrophages absorbing lipids are present, indicating the tissue is alive and lacerated and attempting to heal itself, just like living tissue. 6. Mesenchymal cells are present. According to the dictionary, these are stem cells that have a great capacity of self-renewal. And 7. Live cardiac muscle tissue was present. There is no explanation, no scientific explanation for the existence of fresh blood and live heart tissue present in tests conducted 4 years after the miracle took place. On October 12, 2008, at St. Anthony Church in Sokolka, Poland, one of the priests accidentally dropped a consecrated host during communion. A woman saw it and told the priest, who placed it in water to dissolve and locked it in a safe in the sacristy. A week later, on October 19th, the host was mostly dissolved except for a small portion connected to a red stain. On October 30, What remained of the host was removed from the water and placed on a corporal. On January 7, 2009, a sample was taken to the University of Medicine at Bialystok. Two histopathologists independently declared that the sample was myocardial tissue. According to the doctors, the sample they examined was neither a clot nor blood, but living human cardiac muscle tissue. And even more incredible, it was a cardiac muscle with typical indications of the final phase that precedes death. The two scientists affirm that it is impossible for someone to have placed a fragment of a human body in the tabernacle, since the fragments of the host were tightly interconnected to the fibers of the human tissue and penetrated each other, as if a fragment of bread had suddenly transformed itself. On Christmas Day 2013, at St. Hyacinth's Church in Legnica, Poland, a consecrated host accidentally fell on the floor during communion. It was picked up and immediately placed in a container with water and closed in the tabernacle. Several priests went to check on the host on January 4. They saw that it had not dissolved and that a red spot covered about 1/5 of the surface. They informed their bishop, and he established a special theological scientific commission to analyze the host. Over time, the stain changed from deep red to red-brown. On January 26, it was taken to the Wrocław Forensic Medicine Institute, where scientists immediately excluded the cause as bacteria or fungi. A second analysis found that some fragments appeared to be myocardial tissue. A second opinion was sought at the Institute of Forensic Medicine at Szczecin, without indicating where the sample came from. Scientists there found that the sample was of tissue fragments of cross-striated muscle similar to human heart tissue. They also found human DNA. The next kind of Eucharistic miracle involves consecrated hosts that are preserved for extremely long periods of time. 3 examples of this are in 1597 in Alcalá, Spain, 1730 in Siena, Italy, and 1824 in Onil, Spain. In 1597, a thief stole 24 consecrated hosts from a church near Alcalá, Spain. A few days later, he returned the hosts. The priest decided to put the hosts in a silver container to decompose naturally. 11 years later, the hosts were still intact. They were then placed in a cellar where unconsecrated hosts were also placed. A few months later, the unconsecrated hosts had decomposed, but the consecrated hosts were still intact. They were relocated to a cathedral where they remained until the communists burned the church during the Spanish Civil War in 1936. The priests hid the hosts before they were murdered, but to this day, the hosts have not been found. On August 14, 1730, thieves stole a ciborium containing 351 consecrated hosts from the Basilica of St. Francis in Siena, Italy. 3 days later, they were found in the sanctuary of Santa Maria in Provenzano and taken in a procession back to Siena. To this day, despite there being mold inside the glass container they were held in at one point in time, the hosts remain fresh, intact, and physically uncorrupted. Tests were performed on them in 1914, 1922, 1950, and 1951, all with the same result. Pope John Paul II visited the hosts for adoration in 1980 and proclaimed, "It is the real presence." On November 15, 1824, a former altar boy at St. James the Apostle Church in Onil, Spain, stole a monstrance containing the Holy Eucharist, along with other items from the church. When he tried to sell the other stolen items, he was reported to authorities who arrested him. He would not reveal where the monstrance was located. On November 28th, 13 days later, a woman in a nearby town found the monstrance and returned it to the church. Exactly 119 years later, on November 28, 1943, a delegate of the Archbishop of Valencia confirmed a miracle, that the consecrated host was perfectly preserved. To this day, the miraculous host is still intact after almost 2 centuries. Next are those consecrated hosts that survived being in a fire. There are 4 examples. In 1345 in Amsterdam, Netherlands, in 1383 in Wilsnack, Germany, in 1560 in Moravale, Italy, and in 1595 in Florence, Italy. On March 12, 1345, in Amsterdam, a man who was very ill sent for the parish priest so he could receive the last rites. Shortly after receiving communion, the man vomited into a basin and the contents were thrown into the fireplace. The next day, the man recovered. When his maid went to clean the fireplace, she noticed a light coming from it and saw the consecrated host in the center of the light. The man took the host, wrapped it in linen, and took it to the parish priest. The host reappeared at the man's house 3 times, so it was decided to turn his house into a chapel to house the host. 107 years later, the chapel burned down, but the monstrance with the host remained intact. In 1665, another chapel was designated for the miraculous host, but shortly after it was transferred there, it was stolen. It has never been found. The miraculous host is remembered every Palm Sunday with a silent procession in Amsterdam. In August of 1383, the village of Wilsnack, Germany, was sacked, robbed, and set on fire by a knight named Heinrich von Bülow. In the ruins of the village church of St. Nicholas, 3 perfectly intact consecrated hosts were found. They were bleeding. After they were found, numerous miracles began to occur. The Pope contributed an endowment to rebuild the church. Until the 1500s, Wilsnack was one of the most important pilgrimage places in Europe. In 1522, another fire destroyed the church, and the monstrance holding the hosts was also destroyed in the fire. On April 17, 1560, a fire destroyed the Church of St. Francis in Moravale, Italy. 10 days later, sorting through the ruins, a priest found a pyx in a wall cavity. The corporal was scorched, but the consecrated host was in perfect condition. Pope Pius IV sent a bishop to investigate and declared the occurrence to be unexplainable by natural causes. The miraculous host was displayed in a reliquary at the Church of St. Bartholomew and was still intact 40 years after the fire, but later lost to history. On Good Friday in 1595, at the Basilica of St. Ambrose in Florence, Italy, a lit candle in a side chapel fell off the altar and fell to the ground, starting a fire. The people put out the fire and succeeded in saving the Blessed Sacrament and the chalice. In the commotion, however, 6 consecrated hosts fell from the pyx onto the burning carpet. They were not affected by the flames. 33 years later, the miraculous hosts were examined by the Archbishop of Florence and found incorrupt. He had them placed in a special reliquary that is still used for public adoration. Then there are consecrated hosts that are bleeding. In 1239 in Daroca, Spain, 1247 in Santarém, Portugal, 1330 in Cascia, Italy, 1331 in Blenneau, France, 1405 in Bois-Seigneur-Isaac, Belgium, 1572 in Gorkum, Holland, 1991 in Betania, Venezuela, and 1992-1994 in Buenos Aires, Argentina. In 1239, a chaplain was celebrating Mass for Spanish soldiers when the Moors attacked them. The priest had consecrated 6 hosts to administer to each of the 6 captains who led the troops. He had to suspend the Mass and hid the consecrated hosts. He rolled them into a corporal and then hid them under a rock. When the battle ended with a Spanish victory, the priest retrieved the hosts and found them drenched in blood. The captains received communion and tied the blood-stained corporal to a spear, making it a banner. They carried it into battle and reconquered a castle from the Moors. The 6 commanders each wanted to bring the corporal back to their own regions in Spain. Unable to decide who should get the corporal, they tied it onto a mule and agreed that wherever the mule would stop would be the place to receive the corporal. The mule traveled for 12 days, walking over 200 miles, and collapsed in front of St. Mark's Church in Daroca, Spain. On February 16, 1247, in Santarém, Portugal, a jealous woman was told by a sorceress to steal a consecrated host to use in a love potion. The woman did. She hid the host in a linen cloth that immediately became stained with blood. Frightened, she ran home, and when she opened the cloth, she saw blood dripping from the host. She folded it back up and put it in a drawer. That night, brilliant rays of light came from the drawer. The woman had to reveal to her husband what she had done. In the morning, the couple went and told the priest about everything. The priest went to their home and, with many religious and lay people, led a procession with the host back to St. Stephen's Church. The host continued to bleed for a total of 3 days. Today, people can still see the blood-stained host at the shrine of the Holy Miracle, formerly called St. Stephen's Church. At the Basilica of St. Rita in Cascia, Italy in 1330, a priest was asked to bring communion to a sick peasant. The priest took a consecrated host and put it in between the pages of his prayer book and went to see the peasant. When he opened the book to get the host, it had transformed into a clot of blood that had dampened the 2 pages it was between. Confused and sorry for having treated the Eucharist with such irreverence, he went to seek pardon from a priest, Father Simone Fidati, at the Augustinian Priory. Father Fidati pardoned the priest and asked to keep the 2 blood-stained pages at the Priory of St. Augustine. It is now located at St. Rita in Cascia. This miracle took place during Easter Mass in 1331 at the church in Blenheim, France. As the priest was giving communion to a woman, a fragment of the consecrated host fell from her mouth onto the cloth held by 2 men below the communicant's mouth. One of the men saw immediately that the fragment of the host had fallen and told the priest. The priest tried to pick it up, but it disappeared, and in its place was a drop of blood. The priest took the cloth into the sacristy and tried to wash it, but the stain only grew larger and redder. The vicar was amazed and took a knife and cut out the stained section of the cloth and put it in a reliquary to preserve it. People can still see it today. This miracle occurred in 1405, on the Tuesday before Pentecost, at the Mass of the Holy Eucharist in the Chapel of Isaac, Belgium. When the priest unfolded the corporal, he saw that a particle of the large host that had been consecrated the preceding Tuesday was there. He tried to pick it up to consume it, but it clung to the corporal and began to bleed. The priest turned pale. For 4 days the blood continued to flow from the host, leaving a stain on the corporal. The blood then dried up, and all efforts to remove the stain were unsuccessful. The miracle was seen and attested to by many people. This miracle took place in Gorkum, Holland in 1572. Some Protestant mercenaries entered the Catholic Church there to loot it. They struck at the tabernacle with iron bars and took the monstrance with the Eucharist inside, removed the host, threw it on the ground, and trampled on it with a spiked boot. Immediately, blood began to ooze from the 3 holes that took on the form of wounds. One of the mercenaries was shocked and repentant and told one of the Dutch clergymen who saved the host. In 1594, Catholic King Philip II of Spain acquired the host and placed it in the care of the monastery of San Lorenzo in El Escorial, Spain, where it still can be viewed to this day. The Spanish call the host La Sagrada Forma, which means the sacred form. During Mass on December 8, 1991, at the Marian Shrine of Finca Betania in Cuba, Venezuela, a priest had divided the Eucharist into 4 parts, put 3 of them on the paten, and consumed the 4th part. When he finished consuming the host, he looked down at the paten and saw a red spot on one of the parts. A red substance began to ooze from the spot. After Mass, he placed the host in the sacristy. The following morning, he observed that the red substance continued to ooze out of the particle of host. During Mass, many people verified that the priest had no wounds that could have bled onto the host. It was later found that human blood was oozing from the host. It was type AB, not even the same blood type as the priest. It should be noted that the human blood on the Shroud of Turin and the Miracle of Lanciano also contained type AB human blood. The relics of this miracle can be seen at the convent of the Augustinian Recollects of the Sacred Heart of Jesus in Los Teques, Venezuela. After Mass on May 1, 1992, at St. Mary Parish in Buenos Aires, Argentina, a Eucharistic minister found some pieces of consecrated host on the corporal, and the priest had them placed in distilled water in the tabernacle to dissolve so they could be disposed of properly into consecrated ground. A week later, on May 8th, the pieces had not dissolved as usually happens under these circumstances. Rather, they had become red and looked like blood. On May 10th, what looked like drops of blood were found on the patens used to distribute communion. A parishioner who was a chemist analyzed the pieces of the consecrated host that had not dissolved and found it to be human blood with active white cells. These are found when an infection is present. On this slide, you see close-ups of the 1992 Eucharist that bled. Then on July 24, 1994, a Eucharistic minister took a pyx from the tabernacle and saw blood running along its side. The 5th kind of Eucharistic miracle involves consecrated hosts that sustain people for decades. Anne Catherine Emmerich was sustained for over 10 years on the Eucharist alone. Teresa Newman's only nourishment for 36 years was the Holy Eucharist. Marta Robin was nourished by the Eucharist alone for 53 years. And Alexandria Maria da Costa was nourished only by the Eucharist for over 13 years. Anne Catherine Emmerich was born in Germany on September 8, 1774, into a family of farmers. After being rejected by many monasteries for lack of a dowry, at 28 she finally was accepted into a monastery and became a nun. She experienced a vision of Jesus offering her a crown, either of roses or thorns. When she chose the thorns, Jesus placed the crown of thorns upon her head, and she began experiencing the stigmata as bleeding wounds on her head. Later on, after another vision of Jesus, she experienced the stigmata on her hands, feet, and side. She had many visions of the Passion and early Christians that German writer Clemens Brentano wrote down. For over 10 years, she only consumed the Eucharist and water. Pope John Paul II beatified her on October 3, 2004. Martha Robin was born on March 13, 1902, in Drôme, France, to a family of peasants, and she spent her entire life in her parents' home. In 1928, after a serious neurological illness, Marta found it almost impossible to move, especially to swallow, because those muscles were affected. In October 1930, she began experiencing the stigmata, reliving the suffering of Jesus' passion. Due to an eye illness, she was forced to live in almost absolute darkness. People visited her, and she spoke about her love for Jesus and the Eucharist, who was, as she said, quote, "the one who heals, consoles, sustains, and blesses, my everything," unquote. From 1928 until her death 53 years later, on February 6, 1981. She survived on consuming the Eucharist alone. On November 7, 2014, Pope Francis declared Marta to be venerable, and recognition of a miracle could open the door to her beatification. Teresa Neumann was born in Connersreuth, Germany, on April 8, 1898, in an extremely poor Catholic family. Her greatest ambition was to become a missionary in Africa, but she was a victim of an accident at the age of 20. While helping to pass buckets of water to put out a fire, she fell and injured her spinal cord, causing paralysis in both legs and complete blindness. She was miraculously healed of her blindness in 1923 and the paralysis in 1925. In 1926, she received the stigmata and began fasting, consuming only the Eucharist for the next 36 years until her death in 1962. The process of beatification and canonization for Teresa Neumann was officially opened on February 13, 2005, so she is therefore officially considered a servant of God by the Catholic Church. Alexandrina Maria da Costa was born in Belisar, Portugal on March 30, 1904. In 1918, at the age of 14, to escape assault from 3 men, she jumped out of a window and became paralyzed. On July 30, 1935, she had a vision of Jesus telling her, quote, "I have put you in the world so that you may draw life only from me, to bear witness to the world how precious the Eucharist is. The Eucharist is the salvation of the world," unquote. She also suffered the pains of Jesus' Passion 182 times on Fridays from October 3, 1938 until March 24, 1942. From March of 1942 until her death in 1955, she was nourished by the Eucharist alone. She was beatified on April 25, 2004 by Pope John Paul II. The sixth kind of Eucharistic miracle involves consecrated hosts that have images appear on them. This occurred in 1330 in Cascia, Italy, 1649 in Etten, Peru, 1668 in Les Olmes, France, 1902 in Saint Andre, La Réunion Island, and in 2001 in Srirakonam, India. Here we revisit the miracle of the bleeding host in Cascia, Italy in 1330, in which a priest irreverently placed a consecrated host between 2 pages in his prayer book to take to a sick person's home. In addition to the miracle of the bleeding of the host, the stains on both of the breviary pages also looked like a bearded man's face, mirror images of each other. Here you see the miracle displayed at the Basilica of St. Rita in Cascia. This miracle happened on the night of June 2, 1649, in the Peruvian town of Etten. At the end of a solemn exposition in honor of the feast of Corpus Christi, a Franciscan friar was about to return the monstrance containing the Holy Eucharist to the tabernacle, but he suddenly stopped. In the host appeared the radiant face of a child, framed by thick brown curls. Everyone in the church saw the same vision. Several weeks later, on July 22nd, during a celebration in honor of St. Mary Magdalene, the patroness of the town, a second apparition took place. The divine child Jesus again appeared on a consecrated host, dressed in purple clothing in Peruvian style. The apparition lasted 15 minutes and was seen by many. To this day, Peruvians annually celebrate the miracle of the divine child of Etten. On June 12, 1668, at the parish church in Les Ormes, France, during exposition of the Blessed Eucharist on the Saturday of the octave of Corpus Christi, when the church pastor began to incense the monstrance, the shape of a man appeared in place of the host. The apparition lasted for over 15 minutes, during which time the priest moved the monstrance from the tabernacle to the altar so everyone could see it. The next day the pastor sent a message to his bishop telling him what had occurred. Within weeks, the bishop ordered news of the miracle to be diffused widely. Unfortunately, during the French Revolution around 1798, the vicar of Puy Notre Dame consumed the Eucharist because he feared it would be profaned. At the parish church of Saint Andre, a city on the island of La Réunion, the church's pastor witnessed a miracle on January 26, 1902. While celebrating the 40 hours, the Blessed Sacrament was exposed in the tabernacle. After the elevation during Mass, during the moment of the Our Father, the priest lifted his eyes and saw a bright halo around the rays of the monstrance. Then during communion, he looked at the monstrance and saw a human face with lowered eyes and a crown of thorns on his forehead. After Mass, he summoned the older children in the church to go to the sacristy and look at the monstrance. They reported seeing a man's face on the host. Word spread, and the entire town gathered in the church to see the miracle. The face became animated, and the crown of thorns disappeared as the image became clear. Later, the vision changed again, and a crucifix appeared and covered the host from top to bottom. After benediction, the vision disappeared. This miracle occurred at the parish church of St. Mary in Srirachakonam, India. On April 28, 2001, the pastor of the church began the yearly novena to St. Jude Thaddeus. At 8:49 a.m., he exposed the Blessed Sacrament in a monstrance for public adoration. After a few minutes, he saw 3 dots appear on the host. He stopped praying and invited the congregation to look at the monstrance with him for a while. He then placed the monstrance in the tabernacle. 2 days later, he left the parish and returned on May 5th. When he went to the tabernacle to view the monstrance, he saw a face of a man on the host. He asked others what they saw, and they also saw a man's face. As he and others prayed and watched, the face became clearer and clearer. The monstrance with the miraculous host is still kept in the church. All of the information in this presentation is from Carlo Acutis' website. The address is at the top of this slide. There are many more miracles on his website that were not included in this presentation. You may wish to spend some time on this website and share it with your family and friends to spread the good news about the Eucharist. In addition to looking at Carlo Acutis' website, you may want to read these books that are available at the St. Vincent Ferrer Parish Library. The Eucharistic Miracles of the World is essentially a print version of Carlo's website. Eucharistic Miracles by Joan Carroll Cruz is a very good source that goes into greater detail. A Cardiologist Examines Jesus by Dr. Franco Serafini focuses on the science of several of the miracles in this presentation. Carlo Acutis, the First Millennial Saint by Nicola Gori is a good book for both adults and teens. And lastly, Heavenly Hosts by Catherine Griffin Swigart is perfect for children to read. Cardiologist and author Dr. Franco Serafini has examined 5 of the Eucharistic miracles that appeared in this presentation. In his book, he discusses the extensive medical and scientific research into these miracles, using testimonies of hematologists, oncologists, neurologists, geneticists, molecular biologists, and more, who all came to the same conclusion: that these 5 Eucharistic miracles are undeniably authentic. Each of these miracles relate to each other, as all 5 reveal striated heart muscle tissue, according to Dr. Serafini. In addition, he writes that, with the exception of the Lanciano tissue, which is over 1,300 years old and more degraded, these miracles, quote, all revealed specific pathological signs suggestive of a common and narrow differential diagnosis: stress-induced cardiomyopathy, which anatomical pathologists have identified for many decades in victims of plane crashes or murders after violent beating, and in deaths by stroke or suffocation. Furthermore, Dr. Serafini writes that these 4 miracles, quote, undoubtedly revealed living features, unquote. For example, in the 1996 Buenos Aires sample, there were, quote, white blood cells that were actually living and active at the time of sampling, unquote. They had somehow survived for 3 years in water without dissolving, when normally they would not last more than an hour outside the body. Similarly, in the 2006 Tixla sample, a macrophage was seen under the microscope doing its job of swallowing cellular debris. Dr. Serafini writes, quote, broadly speaking, I believe we could glean 2 complementary principles from the scientific investigations that we discussed. On one hand, there is a language of truth and consistency emerging from scientific findings in regard to what the Eucharistic sacrament means or is. As a Roman Catholic, I feel sustained and comforted by what science has so far been able to tell me about the Lanciano, Buenos Aires, Tixla, and Polish events. The scientific study of the tissues originating from these miracles does not involve embarrassing surprises or theologically equivocal findings. Instead, the concepts of a living and agonizing heart, a suffering blood, and a consistent blood group can only be uplifting for the believer. It is so important to remember that the Blessed Sacrament, the real presence of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, is in front of us at Mass and Eucharistic adoration, and He is always present in the tabernacle. Let us remember the words of Marta Robin, who survived on the Eucharist alone for 53 years. She described the Eucharist as the one who heals, consoles, sustains, and blesses. My everything.